There's a recent Pew Research study that says one in every convert to Catholicism, eight leave the church. And as a priest and a father in the church, I can't help but think about the story of the prodigal son. For the father allows his son or daughter to leave, but he never stops praying for them. In other words, he gives him or her freedom to leave God's house and to live in the world, to live a life without God and his covenant, to live in the world without worshiping God on Sunday, even though my heart knows the agony of the pain of living a life without God. People need to experience it themselves, for the Father understands the disobedient child, or the one who tries to throw off the shackles of his holy religion must learn and experience for himself. Even if he dies in sin apart from God and loses his salvation, he needs to discover his own need for God in his life. For teaching only goes so far, and instructions meant to sink into someone's heart and mind so that they may always remain with the Lord all the days of their life, to aid them in the real world. For there's nothing that is more helpful and profitable than the Word of God. Also, it is meant to sink in, so if they do abandon the Lord, they may come to their senses later in life and find out only receiving the Holy Eucharist in a state of grace really satisfies our soul. For one of the main reasons people leave is they are focused not on getting the log out of their own eye or growing in holiness themselves to become the saint God's calling them to be for the church today. But their focus is on the church this or the church that, instead of simply listening to the Word of God, receiving the sacraments with reverence, and learning to die to sin in their own life. In fact, this is one of the greatest mental disorders in our culture today. Instead of people humbly focusing on their own sins, they pridefully peer and gaze into everyone else's life, and instead of seeking to grow in virtue themselves or doing penance for their own sins, they talk about, did you hear so-and-so did this or that? Instead of praying for the conversion of sinners, they look for them, or they look down upon them to make themselves feel better about their own sins. For in this passage, Jesus does reveal something fascinating, that there is righteous people and holy people within the church by God's grace. For those who remain in a state of grace by following God's commandments and do not commit any serious sins. For the moral of this story reveals that the one son who left slowly died in sin, and he did not realize it until one day. In other words, he was slowly going spiritually and morally bankrupt on his journey away from God until he was broke. He was hungry for God and righteousness amid his sins, and he realized the path he went down was not a road that went to life, but death. For death is more of a spiritual and moral thing than a physical reality. In fact, the story points to the fact that he felt in his heart that he lost his way, and he wanted to be righteous and holy. He truly wanted to do the right thing and change, but he was too weak without the grace of God. Perhaps when we see he came to his senses, it was a moment of grace where God touched his heart and he gave him a vision to return and to begin by confessing his sins. Not simply to confess to God in the sky, but how God designed it in his holy church, where Christ breathed on the apostles and gave them the authority to forgive sins, of which every authentic priest ordained by a bishop with this unbroken line of apostolic succession can grant this pardon of sins. For the church is the house of the living God, the new eternal covenant, where God dwells even in the midst of her imperfections. And he desires to give us every grace and every mercy necessary for our salvation.